before the age of the mighty pyramids, before the rule of the legendary pharaohs, and long before the names of Egypt's great dynasties were etched into stone. There existed a world almost forgotten, two-time world, where humanity was just beginning to build the foundations of one of the greatest civilizations in history. Around 4000 BCE, in the fertile valleys of Upper Egypt, a remarkable culture began to take shape along the banks of the Nile River. This culture, known as the Amratian or Naqada I culture, represents the earliest sparks of Egyptian civilization, a time when small farming villages began to flourish, when humans turned survival into innovation, and when the seeds of Egypt's eternal legacy were first planted. Life for the Amratians revolved around the Nile, the lifeline of their existence. Each year, the river flooded, spreading rich black silt across the land and allowing crops like wheat, barley, and flax to thrive. Farmers used simple wooden tools. Women ground grain into flour. Fishermen cast nets and harpoons into the waters. And herders guided sheep, goats, and cattle along the banks. Their homes were modest small huts made of reeds and mud plaster, but they were more than shelters. They were the birthplaces of family, tradition, and community. When we imagine stepping into an Amratian village, we would see smoke rising from clay ovens where bread was baking. Hear the chatter of families, the laughter of children chasing goats, and the rhythmic sound of craftsmen chipping flint into blades sharper than steel. This was a world alive with simplicity, yet quietly brilliant with innovation. Among their most distinctive creations was their pottery, some of the earliest in Egyptian history, instantly recognizable by its deep red color and blackened rim. These vessels were not only practical containers for water, oil, and grain, but also canvases for creativity, decorated with simple yet meaningful geometric designs, zigzags, spirals, and occasionally human and animal figures. Each pot told a story, reflecting both daily life and spiritual ideas. And these early designs would eventually inspire the symbolic art that came to define Egyptian culture for millennia. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Amratian life lies in their treatment of the dead. In shallow desert graves, bodies were carefully laid in the fetal position, often sprinkled with red ochre color symbolizing life and rebirth. Grave goods such as pottery, beads, flint tools, and even food were placed alongside the deceased, suggesting a belief in an afterlife. These were the first whispers of what would become Egypt's grand funerary tradition, a practice that in later centuries would evolve into elaborate tombs, mummification, and the monumental pyramids themselves. Yet even in this humble form, the Amratians showed that they were beginning to think beyond the present, beyond survival, and toward eternity. Technologically, they were pioneers of their time. Their flint knives and blades were so finely crafted that some rivaled modern scalpels in sharpness. They experimented with weaving and basketry, and by the later stages of their culture, they began using copper tools. Marking the transition from the Stone Age into the beginnings of metallurgy, trade was another hallmark of Amratian society. Far from being isolated villagers, the Amratians were connected to wider networks, exchanging goods and ideas with Nubia to the south, Palestine to the northeast, and even the distant deserts of the east. They imported obsidian for cutting tools, ivory for ornaments, and perhaps even exotic resins for ritual use. Through these exchanges, their worldview expanded, and their culture grew richer. The Amratian period, though brief in the long timeline of Egyptian history, was a time of extraordinary importance. It was during this stage that Egypt's cultural DNA was first written. The concept of ritual burial, the development of artistic symbolism, the reliance on the Nile, the beginnings of long-distance trade, and the innovations that allowed small communities to grow into something far greater. Over time, the Amratian culture evolved into the Gurzian or Naqada II culture, which would further develop the political, social, and religious structures that eventually gave rise to dynastic Egypt. Without the Amratians, there would be no pyramids, no temples, no pharaohs, no ancient Egyptian civilization as we know it. Their legacy lies not in towering monuments or grand inscriptions, but in the quiet beginnings of an eternal story. They were the first Egyptians, the forgotten ancestors of a culture that would shape the ancient world. And though the Amratian culture remains overshadowed by the grandeur of what came later, it is here, in the simplicity of these early villages, that we find the spark of Egypt's greatness. The Amratians remind us that every empire begins with a humble step, every civilization begins with a fragile dream, and that from the mud huts of 6,000 years ago rose a society whose echoes still shape our world today.